Hey, it's Patrick from J&P Cycles, and this is our review of the Husqvarna 701 Svartpilen and the FTR from Indian. Now, I say review, but this is more of a comparison. This is actually the 2019 version of the Svartpilen, and this is the 2020 version of the FTR1200, which has been the same since its inception a year or two ago. Now, full disclosure, I do own this bike right here. I bought this bike earlier this year, have about 900 miles on it. But what got me thinking about this was usage. By looking at these bikes, kind of comparing them by specs a little bit, they may not be something that's comparable, but by usage, you would probably use them for the same thing. And that's what it came down to when I bought the Husky here. I was comparing it to the FTR. These are the final two bikes that came down to my decision to buy a motorcycle. Now, I do have a lot of experience on an FTR. Last year, I rode down to Biltwell's epic El Diablo run on an FTR, the S model, rode it all the way down there through Mexico and back, put about 3,000 miles on it. So I'm very, very familiar with both motorcycles, but let's kind of get into them, why I'm comparing them, and then while we're talking about the usage, we'll kind of talk specs. Now, the word hooligan gets thrown around a lot nowadays. You know, I hooligan race a Sportster, but a real hooligan bike to me is kind of like a do everything, you know, go anywhere type of machine, almost a bit supermoto-ish for the street. The Husky is definitely more supermoto inspired probably than the FTR, but the FTR is very, very established in actual hooligan racing. I wanted a bike that was gonna be fast on the street, that I could spend a lot of time on, I could spend all day on. If I wanted to go hit a trail, I wanted to hit some dirt roads, I wanted to be able to do that. So let's kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of the bikes. This is the bigger bike, of course, about 510 pounds wet. The Husky comes in about 347 pounds wet by the numbers from the manufacturers. This bike and its twin engine makes 123 horsepower with the crank, while the Husky makes 75 horsepower with the crank. When it comes down to horsepower to weight, the Indian has the edge there. This big 1200cc overboard twin really has a lot of grunt down low. I think the claimed torque is about 87 foot-pounds at 6,000 RPM. Doesn't rev particularly high, but the big thumper single here, this is a 692, I believe, cc thumper. Big single, just overgrown dirt bike motor. Comes on, revs up, not quite to 10,000 RPMs. Peak torque happening a little bit higher, I think at 6,700 RPM. They measure it in Newton meters. I think it's somewhere around 87 Newton meters, which is quite a bit lower than this, but it is a single. You do have to wring its neck a little bit more. So in riding these bikes, you have that big hit off the bottom from the Indian here, and it does rev out fairly well.
Man, the mid-range on this thing is bad ass. Going from the Husky to this thing, it's crazy.
Gets a little buzzy in the mid-range. And if you want a more detailed review of this bike, I'll link you to the video. We did a, last year when we got our hands on one of these, we did a detailed review of this. So it does get a little buzzy up there where the Husky really likes to be wrung out. You have to ride this thing. You don't have to. It wants to be ridden over 5 grand. In that 5 to 8, 9,000 range, it really makes a lot of power, and its lightness really makes up for its lack of grunt off the bottom. If you want something that's gonna slam in off the bottom, this is a great motorcycle, but I love wringing this thing out. This big single, when you turn the traction control off, bloop, it'll just pop right up in the air. I mean, it's no problem, it responds right away. But also the weight of this bike kind of makes up for the lack of the big motor. Where you have the 510 pounds here, you only have about 350 pounds right here. So it makes this bike feel faster, where the Indian on pavement in the corners, it feels super fast, no doubt about it, but the Husky always feels like it could be pushed more. Now they do have the Svartpilen version of this, which is like the on-road road race version of this bike. I didn't really gravitate to that because I wanted to go to the dirt side of this bike. And I wasn't disappointed. Both these bikes feel pretty planted on the dirt and in the trails, and both of them have 5.9 inches of travel in the suspension. The Indian, I believe, has a touch more ground clearance, but 5.9 inches of travel, it's a fair amount. On dirt roads and that, you can fly. If you get into real gnarly trails, they're not nearly as capable as like an adventure touring bike, or especially not a straight on dirt bike, but very, very capable. I've ridden some trails on this bike here, some off-road trails and some off-road trails on this bike, and they can get through them, albeit maybe not that fast when you get into kind of some rocky stuff, but the weight of the Husky is an advantage when you're off the road. Plenty of power, and it does the job because you're not hauling all that weight around. You're not having to deal with the weight advantage goes to the Husky for sure. Both of them have a similar bar setup. The Husky has the 1.1 clamping area down to 7/8, kind of a pro taper-esque bar, where the FTR does have a straight up pro taper bar on it. It's a little bit narrower. The Husky has more of, I would call it like a flat track bend. It's a little bit wider, give you leverage on it. Foot position on both of them is pretty good. It's kind of a middle of the road foot position. It's not a rear set, you know, but it's not a mid control either. Both of them are in great spots. I do have bitches with both of them on their foot pegs being too slick, but the FTR wins in the seat department. I've ridden this bike, like I said, 3,000 miles, no problem on that seat. It's nice and comfy, it's big, it's wide. If you're gonna be carrying a passenger, this is also the bike for that. This really isn't much of a passenger bike around town. You'd probably be fine for a short little blast. The seat on this looks really, really cool. Very kind of finished and custom looking seat, but it's basically a 2x4. Doesn't really bother me, I'm used to it, but seat's definitely a win on the Indian here. Suspension wise, 43 millimeter big tubes up front, obviously both monoshocks. This bike gets around pretty well, and the S model has the adjustable suspension. Here I think the Husky wins. It's got the Hot Rod WP suspension, you know, with the KTM tie-in, and you have adjustable suspension up front here with the big clickers on the top for compression and rebound. So a win for Husky in the suspension department. Let's talk wheels and brakes. Some massive brakes on the Indians, the heavier bike. You got those big O Brembos, and you got a radial mount Brembo master cylinder up here. Just an excellent brake setup with those 320 millimeter rotors on the Indian. No complaints there. It has ABS as well. On the Husky, you have a single Brembo on a 320 millimeter rotor. You have a Brembo master cylinder, but it's not the hot rod radial setup you get with Indian. That being said, you know, this is the lighter bike over here. It really doesn't need both of those, both of the calipers that the Indian has, although I wouldn't hate it if it had them both. But the brakes are fantastic on both of these bikes. Both have ABS. Here's my huge complaint with both of these bikes, brakes. They need to make it selectable so you can turn the ABS off on the rear. KTM has a dongle you can get to take care of that on some of the KTM models, like the 790 Scalpel. Please, please, please make these Hooligan style bikes that are meant to be ridden in the dirt so you can take the ABS off the rear. That's a huge downer for me. Other than that, brakes on both these are great, probably a slight edge to the Indian here. You have a 18 in the back and a 19 up front on the Indian. Good looking mag wheels. We have these Dunlop like flat track inspired tires. If you go back to our other video, you can see I have some complaints about that, especially on grooved surfaces. They're just okay in the dirt. Not a bad tire setup. Although again, I wish they would have went 1919 if you're gonna go straight flat track. Let's do that. On the Husky, you have a 17 in the back with a 18 in the front. They are pretty good looking mags. In the 2020 model, they moved to spokes. And that is my complaint with this 19 model is the mags, especially off-road. If you're gonna do a little bit of trails or something, if you hit a big rock or something like that, you could damage the mag. We're gonna have a little bit more flex with the spoke. So great looking wheels. I would just prefer maybe the spoke setup that you get in the 2020s. Now this comes with these Pirellis, these 60 RSs, and I tell you what, man, I could not be more impressed. I haven't had a lot of time on these Pirellis, and they've been great. They kind of surprised me both on the street and the dirt. Plenty grippy on the street to rip through corners and pretty grippy in the dirt. Obviously it's not a knobby tire, but it'll do the job in all of the dirt sections. But overall, both very capable with the tires that are on it, and there are some options out there. Now, circling kind of back to the engine and kind of the accessory setups here. The Indian has a nice USB plug on it, so you can charge stuff up. If you want to put a phone in the handlebars or something, that's nice. The base model has this analog dash, and it has some functionality in it. The Husky has this dash up here, which I've seen some other guys complain about. It's a little weird looking. I mean, honestly, it can be kind of tough to see with a visor on. That's probably my least favorite part of the bike. I really would kind of almost prefer an analog dash here, but this does have something that's very, very, very nice that you don't quite get in the base model Indian. After you get the break-in period over, you can turn the traction control off on this bike. Now, having said that, it's a little finicky. There's a button on the bottom you press and hold. Sometimes you gotta like stop and like roll forward and press it and hold it again, but you can turn the traction control off, and then it's just all bets are off. Super duper, you know, fun bike. Now, having said that, the traction control, not on this bike, on the S model, on the S model Indian, I wasn't all that impressed with. This traction control is actually pretty good. It's not super intrusive. So if you are, you know, on a gravel road, you can whack the thing right open. It's not really dragging the motor down. It's not the big cut-ins like brrr and bringing out power out of the motor. It does it very, very smoothly. So as much as I like riding this bike with the traction control off, the traction control is actually very functional on this bike. Let's start talking about what I would do to this bike, because that's what we're all about, is modifying motorcycles. To start with, on both of these bikes, I ditch these mirrors. I mean, like, I don't know if these guys like just try to put the ugliest mirror they can on these bikes, but both bikes have pretty heinous looking mirrors, so they would go right away. I might actually change this bar on the Husky. I'm considering doing that. Something with a little more of a bend in it, still a dirt bike bar, but I might actually change that. The other thing is, have to do tail tidies on these things. Both of them have particularly gargantuan, big cast or tubular chromoly pieces to hold a tiny license plate and some signals. So we'll have to clean those tails up, get some tail tidies on there, and then they have these big, giant, bulbous kind of turn signals everywhere. Definitely can do a better job of these. We can make them smaller and make them brighter with LEDs. We can definitely help ourselves there. Exhaust, both of these bikes have catalytic converters that are the size of mailboxes. Depending on where you live, obviously you want to be compliant, but there are options out there for both of them as far as slip-ons and decats. The header part of this pipe is really nice, but we could definitely stand to get rid of this huge cat here. Same thing underneath. The Indian, of course, off-road closed competition use only, but get rid of those. I actually like the Husky stock muffler here. It's not too terrible. It's kind of nice and sleek and goes with the bike, but the Indian one is really, really huge. Now, fortunately, S&S makes a slip-on for that. You could put a slip-on on that. You could use an acro link pipe to decat if you're so inclined. And S&S also makes a really rad set of twin high pipes for this bike. Aero and a couple other companies make exhaust for this, but we could definitely make gains in the exhaust. And then fuel control on this, we're gonna squeeze a few more ponies out of them. And so we could lighten these bikes up and kind of just, trim things off of them to really sharpen them up. Get the mirrors off, like I said, raise, get those license plates up with the tail tidies, get rid of things like these big ugly blinkers, and put some good exhaust on there and some fuel tuning, and you're gonna have a great bike. I mean, these bikes are great already. They just need a little bit of sharpening up, in my opinion. It comes down to aesthetics for you. I mean, the Indian is kind of a more heritage, classic looking bike. Having said that, both of these bikes kind of fit in weird niches, right? Like, they're kind of scramblers, kind of not. The Indian is a bit more classic looking, while the Husky just kind of came out of nowhere. To me, it almost looks like more of a flat track bike with a flipped up tail. You kind of have the asymmetrical plate on the one side, but not on the other. It does have kind of a big headlight for the bike, but I like it. It's almost like a number plate with the headlight stuffed in there. Both of them have LED lighting all around as far as headlight and tail light, not turns. So the lighting's good, but this bike is probably a little more polarizing in the aesthetics department. I obviously happen to like it, but Husky/KTM did a good job of finishing this bike off. I said all that to say this: as far as I'm concerned, I don't know if there is a winner here. It's gonna be up to how you wanna use this bike. To me, both of these bikes are true Hooligan bikes. If you wanna get a ticket of some sort, both of these bikes are probably gonna get you a ticket, which is a win in my book. I mean, they just beg to be thrashed everywhere. Dirt roads, corners, in town, curbs, sidewalks. They'll eat them all up and you have a good time doing it. So if you want to possibly take a long trip, this is going to be the way to go. I could see riding this bike across the country, but I don't think you're probably going to have as good a time as this one, whereas this bike's much, much smaller. If you're going to spend more time in the dirt than not, this might be the way to go just because of the weight. Very similar bikes with the trellis frames and the on-off road setup. Two huge wins here. I love the idea of pitting these bikes against each other. Even though they're so different, they are very, very similar in their usage. You can't go wrong. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop us a comment. Go ride those motorcycles.